and welcome. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Gus Palmer Jr. Dr. Palmer comes to us today from the great state of Oklahoma, where he is a linguistic anthropologist at the University of Oklahoma, and he teaches courses such as linguistic anthropology, anthropology in American Indians, and Kiowa language courses. Dr. Palmer is a member of the Kiowa Nation of Oklahoma, and his research interests include the revitalization of native languages, and he has worked on a Kiowa language database and dictionary, and transcribing and translating Kiowa text. He is the author of Telling Stories the Kiowa Way, published by the University of Arizona Press, and has published in journals such as Oral Tradition and American Indian Quarterly. Currently, he is the Director of Native American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And I have to say, for my students who are out there today, you know I am beyond thrilled to have Dr. Palmer here at Eastern. So please join me in welcoming here to Eastern.
Thank you, Meredith, for your kind words. I'm overwhelmed. Meredith was a student of mine in Kiowa some time back, and so she knows some Kiowa expressions and words, and so it's good to be here to talk to her and to kind of get reacquainted and to revisit some of the Kiowa that we worked with when she was there at Oklahoma. I'm thrilled to be here and had a warm welcome, and people are just overwhelmingly kind. They have a beautiful state with the trees, the colors, and all, and I'm very, very much very happy to be there. I want to say a few things in Kiowa to you just to kind of give you a sense of who I am, and want to talk about a power of the spoken word as it is informed in languages, and then as it occurs to me in literature. Kiowa texts, I transcribe Kiowa and the writing system we have, and also translate stories and publish these in journals and in other kinds of venues where I'm required to talk or invited to talk on language and literature. Pantain de akon, u tonga, no kongi, oya del pantain de kon, atol de tsa, kongi an tonga, de oya de kongi ya motanga, not kongi hego, get hito, habe de hen de hego, kongi hego. In Kiowa, I'm saying my name is Pantainde, or White Cloud. The name was given to me by my grandfather, who also bore that name. The name came down to my grandfather and then to me through a story. And so that story has meaning, and it has there's a great deal of responsibility associated with names for Kiowas, for my people, the Kiowas, and so many names that are given to young people, and later as they grow, they sometimes are given a second name, but the name came to me from my grandfather. And so when my grandfather gave me his name, the story with the giving of the name came with it, and the responsibility of that name. So I wanted to let you know in my Kiowa heritage, in my heritage language, how Kiowa is important to us. There are many things happening in Indian country, and I spend a lot of time working in language revitalization in my personal work as a professor and also as a researcher. I write Kiowa and use Kiowa to describe the uniqueness of the language and also its place among the many indigenous languages in our community or in our part of the world. And so I always talk about language revitalization and then follow it up with the sense of where it plays its important role in our community as literature. And to kind of give you an idea of the importance of language, I like to show you some things that are occurring in language communities, and kind of give you an idea of how language is, how it affects all of us, and where it occurs in the world as it comes down to a small tribe like the Kiowas. Language, world languages and cultures are important to us, and it seems that languages are based so much on cultures, so much on how they practice their traditions and their customs, and all these things that go along with various peoples of the world. And so you can't really express yourself as a Kiowa just by doing the dancing and just by doing ceremonies. You also have to know something of the language. And so at the present time, we have 11,000 tribal members, of whom less than 100 are fluent speakers, and I'm considered a fluent speaker. I grew up in a household where my grandparents were bilingual speakers, and so every day of my life as a child, I heard Kiowa and was able to listen and express Kiowa. So I kind of happened on Kiowa, and it was kind of an accident, because during those days when I was growing up, we were speaking English quite a bit, and so language was already on the decline, and native languages have been on the decline ever since 1492, ever since the Europeans came to the Americas, where there were thousands of different languages spoken among these thousands of different tribes. And over time, this has eroded to, we're down to about 300 Indian languages in the Americas. Well, this is North America. In Canada, to the south in South America, there are certainly more languages that are still spoken and still a part of that part of the world. Some things I'd like to look at and talk about is the languages of the world. And so the question comes up, how many languages are in the world? And people generally guess 500, 1,000, 400, 6,000, 4,000, 6,000. And we know that there are close to 7,000. Maybe there are less than that, because every year, somewhere in the world, there's a language that disappears, becomes extinct, and so it's not spoken anymore. It could very well be that we'll end up with, maybe in the next 100 or 200 years, with half of these languages spoken in the world. And so it's very important for us to know where languages are. When we speak about indigenous languages, we like to look at the status of languages worldwide and then gradually break it down to what is left of indigenous languages or Indian languages. And I think people appreciate that, because we don't always have time to talk about languages. Languages spoken in the world kind of break down like this. And these are not in the order of the number of speakers, but you get an idea of which of the following languages are spoken by, mostly by all these people, or these groups. The languages with the most speakers in the world, and we look at these languages in this arrangement here. So you can see right off that English is up there, but it's headed off by Mandarin Chinese. I was in China some years ago visiting. They also have a language problem among the ethnic minorities in the province of Yunnan, where there are about 25 to 30 ethnic groups who still speak their native or indigenous language. I never thought in my life that there were indigenous languages spoken in China. You get a sense that, as what I know of China, even at this late date, was that Chinese was the only language there. I knew there was Cantonese and Mandarin Chinese spoken. I never in my life thought there was also Yi, there was Mu, there was several kinds of ethnic groups speaking their own individual language. They use characters to write their language, but their language is entirely different. And so they have this similar struggle that we have in America, in that the ethnic minorities are trying to revitalize their language, and so they're having a tough time doing that. And the reason why we visited, some of us Indians, American Indian speakers, visited Yunnan, China, is because we wanted to know how they are conducting language revitalization, and found out how important it was for them. Just like American Indians, China overwhelms these small languages. And in America, we're overwhelmed by English. And English is really a killer of languages. It's all over the world. And wherever English ends up, it tends to dominate the whole structure of the communities, the cultural groups, as well as the language communities, speech communities. So you can see that there is this erosion going on worldwide. A lot of the smaller language families want to unite in an effort to keep their languages alive. And so their way of doing that is revitalizing and teaching or presenting some kind of plan or activity to keep their languages spoken. If you just take a look here, you can see how the languages break down, beginning with the Mandarin, Chinese, English, Spanish, Hindi. Some of you may even be speakers. Some of you may have maybe one of these languages is a heritage language of yours. Some of you are maybe bilingual speakers. It's very hard in our country to find a lot of bilingual speakers unless their parents are speakers and they come from communities where a great deal of speaking occurs and they pick up the language. I always thought French was higher, but it's at the bottom somewhere. But that's a lot of speakers. Maybe some French speakers here. The American Indian languages, as we look at languages and see how they affect us as a world, we can see that American Indian languages are here. The largest speaking group is a Diné. It has the most speakers. It's probably closer to 150,000 speakers. The survey that was done here was some 10 years old, so it doesn't show. You don't know if they're going up or down, but for the Diné, they have a college. They have several colleges on the Navajo Reservation in the southwest part of the U.S. It's an area that reservation is very large. It incorporates a four-corner area between states, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. And so the people have that reservation area. And there are a great many tribal members. One of the things that reservation Indians have as an advantage in their language revitalization is that they have a geographical area that is in jurisdictions where the tribes have their own schools, they have their tribal offices, and they have a great influence on the speakers, young and old alike, because since they're in school, the children go and they speak their languages. And so you can see there's an advantage there. For a small tribe like the Kiowas, we live and we're more assimilated in that we live in communities where we're surrounded by English speakers and non-Indians and go to public schools and conduct business in that kind of environment. So there's not a huge demand for us to speak Kiowa. And as a result, we speak English. The children learn English and they go to school. They come home, everybody speaks English. And so that's one of the reasons languages are in such terrible decline. Cherokee people have about 14,000 speakers. And you can see how it's arranged in the west, 1,000. In western North Carolina, and 13,000. It's probably more like 14,000 speakers in Oklahoma. So some of these numbers are just a little off, but you can see there are a great number of speakers, but it doesn't even compare with the Diné people in the Southwest. And so these are people we try to emulate. We visit with them, and we try to find out, Indian tribes try to find out, what is your game plan? What is it that you do that is unique to keep your languages alive? And so they have a great many kinds of programs where young people are speaking on a more daily basis, not just in a classroom, but around the house, around the table with their mothers and fathers, their grandparents. So they have a better opportunity. Speaking languages is not one where you just sit in a classroom and look at a book or just repeat sentences and phrases. Language acquisition is, for second language acquisition, is more of an immersion program where you have speakers working actively on a face-to-face arrangement so that they're talking to each other and learning languages and keeping the language alive. As I say, we have, for our Kiowa people, you can see we're way down at the bottom for speakers. Even the tribal numbers are very, very low. And so if we look at Indian languages and First Nations. First Nations are those speakers, those groups in Canada. If you look at that and see what were the numbers of languages spoken before the Europeans arrived, you get some kind of arrangement like this. And so we think that probably 300, perhaps even 600 languages. It's just amazing to see how many Indian tribal groups were on both the North and South American, in the area of the Americas when the Europeans arrived. And there are numbers that just blow your mind. You think, was it 12 million? Was it 20 million people? And so the number has always moved about because there was no way to accurately show or tabulate how many Indian tribes there were. But you can imagine that probably a long time ago there was probably a number like 600. It seems more like the right number, and not 300. So there are a lot. And also in U.S. and Canada, there are a lot of speakers there. And so we'll use some numbers here to kind of get that. Approximately 200 in both Canada and the U.S., 36 in Canada and 175. And every year, as I say, the languages just, in Oklahoma alone, we've, in the past 10 years, about 3 native languages that were spoken there actively are gone. Wichita is one, Delaware is another. These are Algonquin languages. No, Wichita is Caddoan, Delaware is Algonquin. And Peoria has disappeared. Kiowa is way down there. I'll show you some figures for the Oklahoma tribes, but it just goes to show you how quickly languages are disappearing. So we're always talking about language revitalization and trying to explain what dire straits that languages are in for us. And without diversity, you don't have diverse ways of thinking and sharing indigenous knowledge or just plain knowledge. When languages go, just like anything else, we lose out on how we look at the world and how we solve problems. If we just solve problems in the average of the normal way, we may not be able to solve problems. But some of the indigenous languages contain knowledge that's important for treatment of diseases, for climate change is a big factor among native communities. Many Indian communities are talking about climate change, and it's really been a surprise to me because I never was aware until recently just how much climate change is affecting Indian lives. And it affects Indian lives in such a way that we lose words. If they don't do the ceremonies as they did along in the past, if they don't speak the way they do or tell the stories the way they used to tell the stories, then you lose something of the essence of stories and understanding. And so some of that goes. So all of these factors are important in keeping languages alive. Class A is still spoken by all generations, and that's kind of rare. You might find that among the Diné or the Navajo tribal people. Class B, parental generation and up. For our tribe, probably the parents were speaking pretty much in World War I and in the early teens of the 20th century. And by World War II, we were down to Class C and Class D. In Class C, languages was only spoken by grandparents and their generation. In Class D, that's a level where languages are spoken by the very oldest people, over 70 usually. And for our people, we're less than 100. So you can see we're way down in that category. Many smaller languages, Indian tribes have that same problem. This was in 1997, but this was the arrangement of languages, Class A, B, C, and D. So if we break up all the tribes, we can see that Class A, where there were 20 language groups, Class B, 30, and it gets larger as we go down toward Class D. The prediction is by Class D, 120 by the year. So everybody's moving from A down to D because it's only the older people that are speaking. The problem with all the speakers in Class C and Class D is that when the grandparents, the older people, when they die, there's nobody to replace them as speakers. So for example, when my grandfather and grandmother died, there was nobody to replace them as speakers, so they just take the language with them. And it's strange how Indians treat their heritage languages. In many cases, we have traditional people who still practice the traditional ceremonies and sing the old songs and tell the old stories, and they bear the responsibility of the language, and so they hold that kind of indigenous knowledge in their minds and their memories, and so when they leave, there's no one that comes along that can fill those empty slots, and so that becomes loss of many things, not just language, and that seems to be a problem that faces American Indian languages all over the place. So you see that Class D is the one that grows the largest, and the others are large, but they are opposite, grow in an opposite direction. Here's a language arrangement in Oklahoma. It's my home state. And so I'm aware of these languages right off. We have 37 federally recognized Indian tribes in Oklahoma. And so there are, and many of us know one another. And our languages are completely different, and unless we're from the language family that shares some features of language. These two languages, Arapaho and Caddo, are two, they come from very different language families, and they're just totally different. They're as different as English is different from Mandarin Chinese, and there's such a far range of difference there. And I think one of the big problems that Europeans were faced with when they came to the Americas is they saw all this diversity, they couldn't believe it. Because for a long time, many people from Europe believed in the story of the Tower of Babel in a way, but they had an idea which was very small about language and how it became diversified over time. And they couldn't figure out, it didn't tally up with anything they had read about or anything they knew, and so they couldn't explain them. And so the best thing for them to do was just push them aside and forget about them. So let's just go on with the business of living, teach everybody English and forget about these languages, these crazy languages that we can't understand anyway. And so there was always a mystery about native languages. Where did they come from? How did they happen this way? Where did they just grow out of from nothing and come into being? Or did they come, where did they come from? Did they come from Asia? Did they come from Europe? Where did they come from? And that was always a question. And even today, there are people who still ask the questions. They can't figure out where all these languages came from. And how long. You know, languages take time. Language families as diverse as Algonquin and Caddo and Iroquois, and there's a far stretch between them that couldn't have possibly come from one language family, like French and English and Spanish come from the Indo-European language family. You can easily see the features in them, and if you study European languages, chances are you can study all European languages because they still have the same linguistic features. They still are based on some very permanent features that inform the basis of how they conjugate their verbs, how they use the various lexical categories. But for native languages, they're just all over the place, and it just is an impossible task to figure out how they work. And we have a Muskogean group, and these are estimated speakers, and probably they're pretty accurate. I went through, this survey was done in about 1999, and so I went through and thought these out. The Arapaho, I believe there are less than 100. They're kind of like the Kiowas, which is the numbers are just overrated. Caddoan, that's probably 0 now. The last speakers, I think, are deceased. Cherokee, we know that to be pretty much the same. Cheyenne, an Algonquin language group in western Oklahoma, has around 100. And ours is more, the Kiowas are more like the Cheyenne speakers. Chiricahua, a famous tribe from Arizona that was led by Geronimo when he became a prisoner, and many of them were displaced to Oklahoma. The Diné is also the language family of the Navajo, so their languages are similar. Many of the southwestern languages are similar in that they come from the same language family. Here's some more. Here's a tribe closely related to Kiowas, and their language is completely different than ours. Uto-Aztecan family, Comanches. I don't think they have 100 speakers. There's probably only 25 living Comanche speakers that I know of, and there may be some other speakers, and we don't know. The problem of language, of the status of languages, the problem is that no one really knows what is a fluent speaker, right? So fluency is based on many factors, I think, and so language people and linguists tend to look at those things. Well, language is fluent only in the sense that you can speak to somebody and they can respond to you, like I was speaking to you in Kiowa. If they can carry on a small conversation, tell a story or utter a prayer, or explain something in their language, even very minimal, very short, they are fluent speakers. But for some people, they think fluency, you got to tell a story, you have to tell the whole oral tradition in your native language to be considered fluent. So fluency varies. Even among us, we're fluent. Most of us, I guess all of us are fluent English speakers, but there are various levels of fluency, isn't there? I mean, some people have a larger vocabulary. Some people have a different level of writing ability, and so fluency varies. And so you can't really distinguish that many factors between languages. The Iowa language, we have a few Iowa people in Oklahoma. Many of these tribes, like the Iowa, the Ute, and the Kickapoo, are tribes that were removed in around 1830. President Jackson proclaimed an act of Indian removal in the 1830s. Did I say 1930? 1830s, in which many Indians east of the Mississippi were forcibly removed to Oklahoma, and they called it Indian Territory. So a lot of these tribes that you see here are tribes that were removed from their homelands forcibly to Oklahoma, and so many of them still reside there. Some Indian tribes came from as far east as New England, and I can't remember all of them, probably more like New York, Cayugas, Senecas, we have those tribes in Oklahoma. Some of the other tribes, Onondagas, we have a few of those. No Mohawks, no Tuscaroras, but those tribes live in Oklahoma because they were removed. But there are others who resisted and stayed in their homelands in New York. So you can see here's my tribe, the Kiowa. And I put a question mark there because in my mind, I say less than 100. Other people will argue there were at least 100 speakers. And I say, well, name them. They don't need, because I know most of the speakers, and if you just name them, I would know who the speakers are. All of the speakers, all of my relatives, we call them cousins in English, but in Kiowa, we don't have a word for cousins. So all of the people I'm related to out of my generation are either brothers or sisters, and that's just the way our relations work out. All of my brothers and sisters don't speak Kiowa. I speak Kiowa to them and try to force them to respond to me, but most of them shake their head and say yes, yes, and revert to English, so I have trouble. And one of the problems is that many speakers, so-called younger speakers, I'm not that young, I'm only 21. So the speakers in my generation tend to speak English, they feel comfortable and don't want to speak their heritage language for a lot of reasons. And I guess for a long time, many of us who were speakers in our community, the grandparents were purists, they were traditional, and if you made a mistake, they would laugh or they would correct you. And so I think a lot of our speakers and the speakers in our tribe tend to be shy about it and don't want to speak it because they think there's a more correct way to say it. And if I say it this way, it's not going to make sense. So you have to risk it. You have to risk making mistakes in order to learn. And that's finally coming home to many of us in our tribe, so that people who are teaching language are now allowing people to take more risks, and they're trying to speak their language more. I want to move along. I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I thought this is important when we talk about language revitalization, because you have to see numbers to believe what's going on in the language world. And these are stark figures, because once the language is gone and not spoken, it's gone forever. You don't see it anymore. And we know about species of animals and birds that become extinct. You can imagine when a language is gone, it's gone. It takes everything with it. It takes everything about weather. It takes everything about relationships and families. It takes everything of that knowledge, and it's gone forever. If the language stays, there might be something. It might be a cure for cancer based on some expressions, based on some belief system and that knowledge base. But when it leaves, what do we have? We don't have anything. So I'm an advocate for language diversity, that we all share in this, and that we're a great family of languages, and that we need these kinds of things to exist as people. Do you ever when you see so many different Indian tribes in Connecticut? What do you have? The Pequots? What other tribes here? What are the other tribes? There are several other tribes, I think. But just to show you that there are all these things occurring. One of the things that I like to do and talk about is when I'm talking about language and language revitalization, and I continue this idea of the power of the spoken word, is that native languages also bear with them in their speech, in their practices, literatures. And I call them oral literatures. A lot of people will argue, well, how could it be literature? It's not written. In many cases, it isn't written. Many of these languages are just spoken. They're just spoken because there is no writing system. So they prefer to tell the stories in their native language. And all the stories that I know, that I grew up and learned, or languages that my grandfather and grandmother told, as well as relatives who came to our house all the time. There were all kinds of old people, relatives mainly, who came to our house, and they came and they spoke Kiowa. They told stories in Kiowa. They did everything in Kiowa. And as a child, I ran around there and I picked it up and took it for granted. Because I grew up as an adult and just spoke English, and as an older person, I was hired to teach Kiowa. And it finally came home to me that it was important for me to speak my heritage language and to try to save it in some way, try to preserve it and the essence of it. And so I started, we have a writing system that was created by Parker McKenzie, and it's the writing system that I use to teach Kiowa. And out of that, I was able to collect stories, recordings of stories I heard and stories that I remember, and I would transcribe them in Kiowa and then translate them and use that as a way to talk about literature. So it's a wonderful literature of oral traditions all across the Americas, and I'm afraid that we're going to lose a lot of this when these languages disappear. So if you're ever within supporting language revitalization, be sure that you speak up for these languages. These Kiowa texts are resources of literature. As I say, they're important because they inform how one of the genres of storytelling are the trickster tales, or tales about, and tricksters are animals. These are animals that are very cunning and clever. And so as a form of entertainment, and also as a form of teaching moral lessons of how to behave like human beings and not animals, they have these stories. And when I grew up, my grandfather told we had a trickster, Kiowa trickster. His name was Sende, and he was kind of a person. He was kind of a coyote. He was kind of a bird, a crow maybe. He could change into anything. And he was animate or inanimate, but many of the things that I learned as a Kiowa person came by way of these stories. And they were funny because, children learn a lot, and they don't want to hear a boring story. They want to hear something that's full of all these funny things. And so the trickster stories are very funny. And to get the point of trickster stories in Kiowa, if you hear it in English, when you translate it, it loses everything. It loses a flavor. It loses those special sound elements you need to make people laugh. And so when I transcribe them, they're okay in Kiowa, but when I revert back to translation, they fall flat. And as you know, if you work in translation, you cannot take a story and really get a good English rendering of that because it doesn't carry the full flavor of the language. And so we get part of a story, and we do the best we can. There are many translators who do work very, very hard they want to stay true to the language and to the expression, so they try to translate stories into English and get close to it, but not quite there. In any case, these stories come through, and many of them are funny. What happens when all indigenous languages disappear? Well, a lot of things happen. For one thing, We lose indigenous knowledge. We learn valuable things about worldviews, philosophies, and so it's important for us to keep those going. What happens to the literature of indigenous peoples when their languages die? Well, we lose trickster stories, we lose the oral traditions, the memoirs. We lose a lot about the history of the people, because once that goes, once that leaves, there's nothing left of it. And so that becomes a problem. And so we have to pay attention to those things. See, other things. The Kiowa texts we have in our Kiowa texts, and I just want to enumerate and go over some of these things to give you an idea, better idea of what we mean by Kiowa texts. In the linguistics world, we can call them stories, we can call them narratives, but I think the people who work with languages and do documentation and description of languages like to talk about texts, and those are stories. They're stories that you can write down and look at and analyze and so on. For Kiowas, the texts include origin narratives, a story of when the world began and who populated the world, who was in charge, and all of those things come through in the origin narratives. Kiowa has a very rich tradition, oral tradition of these origin stories. It's a cycle of stories that go around. And our grandfather would start telling a story of Sende bringing the people out of a hollow log a long time ago. And then he attached that story to the little girl climbing up the pine tree that grew into the sky. And the son took her and raised her, then married her, and they had a child. That child came down. There are all of these important elements in this story, just like you read in the book of Genesis. There's a story to it, but it's attached to all these different creatures and all these different beings in the world. And so these origin myths and narratives are important. The thing that happens with these stories is when the people quit speaking, the stories just go with them. If you don't have a recording, if you don't have a written down story in the language, in a translation, you're likely to lose those. And so origin narratives are very important. They'll probably be at the top because they really tell a lot about the origin of the people, and they say a lot about their historical emergence into the world. Trickster stories, as I said, they're very important. It's a whole genre of stories. There's a modern vein of trickster stories by modern writers like Gerald Visner, Thomas King, Louise Erdrich. Many of the writers, Sherman Alexie, all of the writers, contemporary writers, include something of that trickster narrative in their storytelling. It's very effective. It makes us laugh. We can change things. And so they entertain us and they teach us things about the people and how they think. When languages disappear, I think we lose something. We lose something of the nuances. We lose something of the sense of stories. And there's a sound element in languages. In Kiowa, without that sound element, it's hard to tell stories. You can't even think of the stories because you got to think about stories. Are they all memorized, or is there something in language and how it sounds that keeps it in our memories? And we all know the story about the Iliad and the Odyssey if you study classical epic poetry. And you know that Homer, whoever he was or whoever they were, was able to tell a story. It's a long story. If you've read the Iliad, you ever read the Iliad in English? It's hard in English, but you can imagine it was in Greek. How did it hold together? How did it contain itself for hundreds or thousands of years before we translated it into English and we could refer to it in classical literature? But it came down anyway. And it was always an argument. What is the power of oral utterance? What is there in there? Because it certainly wasn't memorized. If it was memorized, it's an impossible task. Some of it is memorized, but a lot of it is based on that iambic pentameter. There's a rhythm and sound, ba-boom, ba-boom, and it goes throughout the text, and it's in sets, patterns that are easy to think about and remember because they fit somewhere. They're pleasing sounds in the mind, so storytellers could keep that up. Even before languages were written, they had to rely on some way to remember these stories. And so in Kiowa, we do something similar, very similar. I'm going to be talking in an English class tomorrow about that phenomenon about what is this magical thing? What is it that the Kiowas remember so much? Because my grandfather could tell the whole origin myth in Kiowa and not miss a beat in it. There was something about the sound. There was something in the structure of the mind and thinking about the sound and the power and nature of language that when it was spoken, you remembered it. And so that's something that I'm fascinated with. And many of the papers that I publish are based on this whole idea of that the spoken word is powerful and it's kind of magical. It has something there that even linguists don't know. They try to understand it and can't even explain it. Even I can't do it, although I'm close to, I work with it a lot. I just can't quite put my finger on what that thing is that has us remember so much. The historical and wisdom stories are important. They're like proverbs. They're like stories in texts in the Old Testament or the Torah. These are stories that tell us how to behave, how to live, and how to do. And I certainly had enough of those wisdom stories as a child because I was very mischievous, as I told some of my friends. And so my grandfather would tell me a lot of these stories just to make me behave because he didn't want me to go wrong, right? And so I had to think about those things. And there are just other things here, and these are probably things that are important. What's important recently is that my son is a filmmaker, and he makes films, and he got me interested in film. I made a film a long time. I used to write. I did poetry and so on. Wrote a script and made a film a long time ago. And so and I think it influenced my son to become a filmmaker. And so he's a professor of film now, assistant professor in film. But he also does this. He's an independent filmmaker. And he says, Dad, I got a great idea. I'm going to make films and let's use language. And language revitalization, young people they like to look at text. They like to look at the screen. They visit the internet all the time, and they like movies and all. He says it's a very effective way to teach language, and so I got involved with that. And so I brought a clip that he and I made, and it's a story. It's about an 8-minute clip, but we use it in language revitalization. So young people like to see the action of cinematography, but they also like to listen, so they listen to sounds. And we did this one in Kiowa with subtitles in English and Kiowa. And so it's a very effective resource for teaching and working with language revitalization. And there's a little bit of literature in there because we also tell stories. We told the origin. We're working on one about the origin story of Kiowas, and we're using a lot of Kiowa in it. So if we can go ahead and put that up on the screen, we'll go ahead and take a look at that. And
go on, your back on. Mon yi ki on totan sao ya so teto. Ayo de ki on ya hego ya dot. Hego mo ya oboy keko. Deki, deki. Oyo de Kida, Gapendo Somite. Deki. Hayabat Alta. Song again. Hunget ag. Ahon de ki. Song again. Daba get kuda. On your bedom. Mo tong tai a day gets they on the
You can tell that's me by my hair. I guess we could open up for questions. We got time for that, Meredith? Thank you. So, yeah. It's a pretty sunset. Do you see sunsets like that in Connecticut? It just gets black. It just gets dark. Yeah, but you can see it's very stark around the mountains. You know, you see a lot of rocks. Meredith, you remember that out in the Wichita Mountains. And historically, the Kiowas hung out there quite a bit. They felt safe by the mountains because it was there was wood, there was water, and they could climb up into the rocks and hide from their enemies. It was just the mountain. One of them is Mountain Scott. I don't know if you've ever driven up there. Drive to the top. About 2,000 feet or so. To us, it's a mountain. Of course, it's in Oklahoma, it's pretty flat. So 2,000 feet is just, that's Mount Everest to us. But you could drive up there. But the story is that when the buffalo disappeared, and they disappeared off the land very, very quickly at the end of the 19th century. They were destroyed by Buffalo Bill and a lot of those guys, just shooting them, killing them, destroying them. But the Kiowa say that their explanation for the disappearance of those animals was that there's a door on the north end of Mount Scott, and it opened, and all the buffalo went in, and it closed, it shut. And so the story is that one day it'll open, and a buffalo will come in, and surely it didn't open, actually. It's this metaphor, it's this idea of that opening and the buffalo coming out. But if you go to Oklahoma now, there are people who are raising herds of buffalo. You know, they're using that, they're selling the meat. I'm not a fond, I don't know that much, and I can't say how it tastes, but I understand it's good, it's steak, you know, it's good steak. But there are ranches, bison ranches all over the place now. And if my grandfather was here now and he saw those, he said, yep, there they are. They came back out of the mountain. It would be his explanation that the buffalo have returned. What does that mean? Does it return? Do we return back to the old ways? Do we return back to the essential philosophical ideas we had as Indians? Is that coming back? I don't know. There's a lot of mystery tied in that. But it's a good thought to think that there are some good things that come back to us. And so it's always been important. Yeah.
You showed the numbers with the Navajo having so many more speakers.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that they do some programs to help.
Yes.
Did they start off with much higher numbers too? Or are their programs so effective, or are they doing something different? Or
I think because, as I say, the reservation Indians kind of have a captive audience group of people, I think. And they have tribally controlled colleges and public schools so that the instructors are essentially Navajo people, and they speak their language. So they go in a classroom, a typical classroom, say in elementary school, and talk to the children in Navajo as opposed to English, which we do in our public schools. So I think they have a captive audience for one thing. And then the tribal organizations, they got radio stations, they have television. They also have newspapers and magazines that they print in Navajo because they have a writing system. And I think that reinforces language acquisition, and it keeps the language alive, where our tribes who are assimilated tribes that don't have reservations are just scattered all over the place. We have no control on the schools and so on. So you can see very easily reservation Indians have a better opportunity to do that. But at the same time, you have to also think, a lot of the young people can't find employment opportunities on the reservations. They still leave the reservation and move away. And when they move away, they raise their children, who in turn speak English. So you see, you're reinforcing it. You can't escape it. It's just, the same thing is happening in China. The older people and parents want to keep their children at home, but they want to go to Shanghai and Beijing because that's where the jobs are. And when they get there, they have to speak Chinese, and so they lose their heritage language, and they raise their children that way. So it's just a never-ending cycle of you build it up and it falls down, you build it up and it falls down, so it's kind of like a struggle going on. Oh.
So when the system of writing for this language was developed, did we see numbers of people who were retaining the language increase, or was there a steady decline?
Yeah, as an instructor, as a teacher of Kiowa, I think that the numbers increase where there's more of an interest. The students who come from Kiowa country and enrolled in the Kiowa classes at the university come there and they seem more committed to it, I think, because they understand the urgency that their grandparents are no longer here, and they want the responsibility of fulfilling the tribal need to speak their language. And so they come and they learn a system to write, they learn a system and they want to speak it. And so I think that reinforces it. I see more of our younger Kiowa people trying to do that. The thing that's hard, though, is that they can learn it in books and in a classroom, but it's not like going into the community and speaking every day. And that's the hard part. That's the part where we're having trouble, because we don't have speakers actively engaged in language just at home. You know, children, intergenerational, you got to have older people and younger people just engaging the language in a normal way, just like we do here. We just don't get that. It used to be that they were doing that all the time because they were dependent on the spoken word to conduct their world and their lives, they tell their stories. So the spoken word is very powerful. And I think it carries into lots of things about how we think about what we do. There are so many things that we're finding out about indigenous languages, even in South America, that are helping us produce better foods to treat illnesses. Because in the language itself, there are stories about how to do things. There are certain plants, all of the languages and all of the treatments of diseases, many of them, about 80% of them are based on indigenous treatments, plants, different kinds of things that they use. Penicillin comes from mold. It's a simple thing, but it's useful. So those are the indigenous things that we will lose if we quit talking about them and people quit explaining how do you use this? How do you treat a cold? My grandfather was a medicine man and also an Indian doctor, and I've had all kinds of diseases when I was a child, but he was a doctor and explained those things, and so I know about those things, but I'm not a medicine man myself. Still, there are others in the tribe still practicing tribal medicine and healing practices that help to sustain their health. Aho is thank you. Can you all say aho? Aho. Thank you. Aho.